You can see here, starting in 1952 with the RSV, how many English translations have come out over the past 50 years. Holman Christian Standard Bible, today's New International Version, the Revised NIV. Now, I do want to take a minute here to talk about the relationship between translations, because not all translations start from the Greek and Hebrew. I've already mentioned that the New Living Translation started from the Living Bible, but also with our teams of Greek and Hebrew scholars working, comparing the English text with the Greek and Hebrew text. So we start with William Tyndale, who did his translation from Hebrew and Greek, and the King James Version is largely a revision of Tyndale's work from the 1520s and 30s. Then, starting with the ASV, the American Standard Version of 1901, now from this point forward, most of the New Testament translations are based on what we now think of as the UBS Greek text, rather than the Textus Receptus. The RSV is a revision of the ASV. The New American Bible, sponsored by the Catholic Church, is a brand new translation, unrelated to the others. The NASB, New American Standard Bible, is a revision of the ASV. The Living Bible, as I described, was paraphrased from the ASV. The NIV was a brand new translation. The New King James Version is, of course, a revision of the Old King James Version. The New RSV was a revision of the RSV. The CEV was a new translation. The New Living Translation was based partly on the Living Bible, as I've described. The ESV was another revision of the RSV. Holman Christian Standard Bible was a new translation. And the TNIV is a revision of the NIV. And then, starting last year, Zondervan began publishing what is called the 2011 edition of the NIV. So you can see that the ASV, the American Standard Version, is really the parent translation for all of the rest of these translations here. The best-selling translations in the US, and I think this is probably true here in Singapore as well. The New International Version is the best-selling English translation. The King James Version is still the #2 translation in terms of sales. New Living Translation is #3. The New King James Version, #4. English Standard Version, #5. And then in the United States, because we have such a large Spanish-speaking population, the Reina Valera is the next best-selling translation, obviously Spanish. And then the New American Standard Bible. So this is the sequence of the number of copies that are sold in the US, and I think also in Singapore, with the exception of Reina Valera. We've talked about 2 translations of philosophy, and all of these translations listed here would fit into the category of formal equivalence. And then dynamic equivalence, the CEV, also called the Good News Bible, and the New Living Translation. And then the NIV and its related translations, the TNIV and the 2011 NIV, are kind of a mixture between formal equivalence and dynamic equivalence. And the Holman Christian Standard Bible would also fit into that category. Let's look at just a couple of examples of the difference between formal equivalence and dynamic equivalence. In Matthew 25:15, the story of the rich ruler who gave something to his servants. What did he give? The King James Version translates the Greek word talenton as simply talents. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, and to another 1. So the word talents is used in the King James Version, New King James, NASB, RSV, NRSV, ESV, and Holman Christian Standard Bible. The NIV retained the term talents, but called it talents of money, to give the reader a sense that that's what we're talking about. Jesus was talking about some amount of money that was given to the servants to invest. The TNIV, rather than calling it talents of money, moved away from the word talents altogether, called it bags of gold. and the NIV 2011 edition also calls it bags of gold. The New Living Translation calls it 5 bags of silver. It doesn't really matter if it was gold or silver. The point was, it was 5 of a large quantity to one servant, 2 of that same large quantity to another servant, etc. And the CEV called it 5,000 coins to one. So you see there the way different translations have handled it. You can call it a talent, you can call it a talent of money, a bag of gold, a bag of silver, 5,000 coins. Here are some of the issues in translation. We've already talked about what source text we should use. Should we retain the paragraph and sentence structure of the Hebrew and Greek as closely as possible? Is it permissible to add words or phrases that are not explicitly in the original text? How should we translate technical data? How should we translate idioms? How should we translate similes, metaphors? How do we translate poetry? How do we translate gender language? And then there are some things that are unique to Bible translation. How do we render the divine names? There are many divine names in the Old Testament and New Testament. Should we capitalize divine pronouns? That's something that the Straits Times doesn't have to deal with much, but when we're talking about Bible translation, you have to decide right up front. If we're using he and him in reference to God, do we capitalize it or not? How do we handle parallel passages in the Gospels, for example? How do we handle Old Testament quotations in the New Testament? How do we handle the spelling of proper names? There are thousands of proper names in the Hebrew and Greek text. How do we render those in English? What do we do with the law terms in the Old Testament? There are many law terms. How do we handle genealogical data, weights and measures and references to time? What do we do with dates in the Old Testament, technical poetic terms in the Psalms? We've already talked about the source texts. The Hebrew, everybody uses the Masoretic text. Greek, for the New Testament, we have to decide, are we going to use the Textus Receptus, which the New King James Version translators said, we're going to stick with the Textus Receptus, just as a matter of philosophy. And everybody else uses the text called the Nessel-Aland or the UBS text. I'm going to skip through this part, some of the differences between Textus Receptus and UBS text. But let's talk about whether we should retain the sentence structure of the original as much as possible. So as an example, in Romans 1, verses 1 to 7, in the Greek text, it's one long sentence. It's actually in a letter format, and I'll show that in a second. The ESV is philosophically committed to maintaining the sentence structure as much as possible. So the Greek uses one sentence, ESV uses one sentence, and it's a long sentence. The New Living Translation uses 9 sentences. We did not feel philosophically that we needed to stay with the sentence structure. We wanted to make sure that the meaning came through as clearly as possible. So here's an example from Acts 23:26 of the typical elements of a letter in New Testament times. Starting off with the person who was writing it, in this instance Claudius Lysias, to the recipient, in this case His Excellency Governor Felix, and then typically in a Greek letter you would start with the Greek word kairein, which is translated here as greetings. Claudius Lysias to His Excellency Governor Felix, greetings. Now let's look at the opening of Romans. Those same elements are there. In the literal translation of the ESV, it starts off, Paul, that's who sent it. Then you go through this long introduction, and then to all those in Rome who are loved by God and called to be His saints, and then grace. But you remember back here, the typical term is kairein, and Paul does a play on words here. He uses charis. Instead of greetings, he's saying grace to you. So the letter to the Romans, and this would be true of most of the New Testament letters, follows this same kind of format. Who it's from, who it's to, and then some kind of grace. So in the ESV, this is all one long sentence, because in the Greek it's one long sentence. And the NLT, I won't read it, but you can see the same elements. I've underlined them here. This letter is from Paul, and then you come all the way down here. I am writing to all of you, and may God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ give you grace, or charis, and peace. But here the NLT uses 9 sentences because it's such a long and complex introduction to the book of Romans. Here's an interesting question. Is it permissible to add words or phrases not explicitly in the original text? In word-for-word philosophy, generally the answer is no, you can't do that. If it's not there in the original, don't put it into the English. But note, if you're used to using the King James Version or the New King James Version, there are, in fact, lots of italicized words. And those are words that don't represent an original Hebrew or Greek word. They've been added into the English text to help make sure that the text, the translation comes through clearly. In dynamic equivalence, we say yes, it's permissible to add words or even phrases not explicitly in the original if it helps to communicate the meaning of the original text. So here's an example I'm using as a literal translation. This is the first verse of the first book of John. NASB renders it this way: what was from the beginning, what we have heard, what we have seen with our eyes, what we have looked at and touched with our hands concerning the word of life. New Living Translation, I've put in red here examples of additional words that are added in English to make sure that the message comes through clearly. We proclaim to you the one who existed from the beginning, whom we have heard and seen. We saw him with our own eyes and touched him with our own hands. He is the word of life. So 2 different philosophies of translation. Another example from 1 John, we love because he first loved us. Well, a pastor would ask, what does it mean, we love? We love whom? We love what? We love because he first loved us. What did John mean there? The New Living Translation renders it this way: we love each other because he first loved us. And then we have a footnote to show that the Greek is simply we love. And there are other manuscripts that read we love God. Still others read we love him. But our translators felt that in the context of what John was talking about, he was really talking about the relationship between one another. We love one another because he first loved us. I'm going to skip over this example. How do we translate technical data, weights and measures? So one of the measures that's used frequently in the Old Testament is cubits. A cubit is about 18 inches long, which would be, about 40 centimeters, for those of you who think in metric. The ESV, in describing Noah's Ark, renders it pretty literally: the length of the ark, 300 cubits, its breadth, 50 cubits, and its height, 30 cubits. The NIV 84 edition rendered it in feet, 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, 45 feet high. But in the new NIV that just came out last year, they switched back to cubits. An interesting change from the 1984 to the 2011 NIV. New Living Translation never uses cubits because we don't think in cubits. You have to pull out a Bible dictionary to find out what is a cubit. So the NLT always uses feet. And by the way, we're in the process of doing an anglicized edition, and in addition to spelling favor and honor, your way of spelling it, we've also used metric measurements rather than the American measurements. I'm going to skip over this again in the interest of time. It's kind of fun to play with some of this stuff, cores and homers and boths. How do we translate idioms? The King James Version, the story of Saul and David. He came to the sheepcotes by the way, where was a cave, and Saul went in to cover his feet, and David and his men remained in the sides of the cave. Well, when we hear the term cover your feet, we might think of putting a blanket over your feet. But it's an idiom. What did it mean? New Living Translation, Saul went into a cave to relieve himself. He went in to go to the loo inside this cave. And so the NLT renders it a little more clearly rather than simply translating the words of the idiom to cover one's feet. Here's another example, to gird up one's loins. Then he said to Gehazi, this would be Elisha, gird up your loins and take my staff in your hand and go your way. Well, girding up your loins was taking the hem of your robe and tucking it into your belt. That was what it talked about, girding up your loins. But the NLT renders it this way, get ready to travel. And then you see in the footnote, because we translated the meaning rather than the words, we put the literal Hebrew in a footnote, bind up your loins. Now in Job, this expression, gird up your loins, is used metaphorically. And the Lord is saying to Job, gird up your loins like a man, and I'll ask you and you instruct me. So the NLT renders it this way, brace yourself like a man, because I have some questions for you. So girding up your loins, that's simply an idiom that we don't use in the modern world, so the NLT renders the meaning in that way. A Sabbath day's journey. Well, what's a Sabbath day's journey? Once again, you have to pull out a Bible dictionary to get the answer to that. So the NLT renders it in terminology that would be more readily understandable, a distance of half a mile. But sometimes similes work perfectly well in the Hebrew or Greek and in the English. Jesus, referring to the multitude, said they were like sheep without a shepherd, and the NLT translates it the same way. They were like sheep without a shepherd, because that's a simile that works perfectly well in English, even in a non-agrarian culture. You probably don't have many sheep in Singapore, and I know we don't have many sheep in Chicago, but we understand nonetheless that concept of being like sheep without a shepherd. And let's see if we can find one more interesting thing, and then we'll get you out of here. Issues about how to translate poetry, how to translate gender language. Sorry, we don't have time for all this fun stuff. Here's an example in Ephesians, the King James Version, peace be to the brethren. Brethren, of course, is an old English term for brothers, and Paul really is giving a blessing to the men and the women in the Ephesian church, so the New Living Translation renders it, peace be with you, dear brothers and sisters, and then a footnote to show that, yes, we understand that the Greek word is simply the word for brothers, but Paul meant brothers and sisters, men and women, in this context. But there are other places where you have to render gender-specific terminology like wives and husbands, because that's very clearly what Paul meant. So the ESV in Ephesians 5:22, wives submit to your own husbands as to the Lord. Similarly in the NLT, for wives this means submit to your husbands as to the Lord. Divine names, I'm going to skip through this. In most places, the New Living Translation uses, for Yahweh, we use Lord with small capitals, and that's the format that's used in most modern translations. But there are a few places where we felt that we should use, in this instance, Abraham named the place Yahweh Yireh, which means the Lord will provide. Capitalization of divine pronouns. The King James Version does not capitalize the pronouns for God, his, he. The New American Standard Bible does capitalize those pronouns. New Living Translation, we had lots of discussions about this, but we decided not to capitalize those pronouns. Parallel passages. I want to get to the final slide here. Oh, I can't pass over this, how to render dates. In Zechariah 1:1, it starts off, in the 8th month of the 2nd year of Darius. And that would be a literal translation. Well, when in the world was the 8th month of the 2nd year of Darius? And what is the 8th month? In our calendar, the 8th month is August. Is he talking about August? No, he's not. He's talking about the ancient Hebrew calendar. And the NLT is rendered this way: in November of the 2nd year of Darius's reign, and then a long footnote that explains that we can cross-check when the 8th month of the 2nd year of Darius was, and that corresponds with the months of October and November in the year 520 BC. Similarly, Zechariah 1:7, the 24th day of the 11th month, the month of Shabbat. If you don't know what the month of Shabbat represents, you might assume that the 24th day of the 11th month must mean November 24. No, the month of Shabbat is not the same as November. So the NLT renders it, we say 3 months later on February 15, and then in the footnote show the actual year, 519 BC. How do we handle traditional terminology like propitiation in the King James Version, expiation in the RSV? The ESV goes back to propitiation in this verse from Romans. The NIV renders it sacrifice of atonement. TNIV, similarly, sacrifice of atonement. New Living Translation, sacrifice for sin. If you were to ask the average person, even the average Christian on the streets of Singapore, what is propitiation? They would say, I have no idea. So why give them, I think I just lost my sound here. Why give them a Bible translation that uses a word that they don't understand? I might have turned this off. Nope. I think I ran out of battery, so it must mean that we're done here. Conclusions. Just a reminder that the King James Version and the New King James Version use a different base text in the New Testament, not terribly different. There are no theologically important differences between the Textus Receptus and the UBS text, but they are different. Formal equivalents and dynamic equivalents have many differences in wording and style. For the most part, they don't have different meanings, just different ways of expressing it. Both styles of translation are valid, but they're useful for different purposes. It's often useful to use the different translation styles side by side, so you can put the New Living Translation alongside whichever other translation you might already be using. And you'll see very quickly the differences, and I think you'll find that the New Living Translation is always easy to read and understand. We can help our parishioners, for those of you who are pastors, understand the Bible by explaining it to them. But if we use a dynamic translation like the NLT in the first place, we won't have to explain the meaning of the words in the text. Instead, we can spend our time encouraging our people to apply the meaning of the text in their own lives. And don't let anyone tell you that only one translation style is legitimate. It just ain't so. There's value in both kinds of styles, and we're happy to give you today, as you've seen in your bag, a copy of the New Living Translation, so that if you're not familiar with the NLT, you can become familiar with this translation. It's not a brand new translation. It's been out since 1996, but I know that not everybody in Singapore is using the NLT, so we're delighted that you have been here with us today to get just a little bit of an orientation to the NLT and the larger work that we've been doing over the past 50 years at Tyndale House Publishers. So, Jim, that brings us to the end of our